Nick Meyer is a senior instructional media strategist at Excelsior University with a history of building strong teams, efficient workflows, and high-quality media content. We recently had the opportunity to discuss best practices and emerging trends about instructional media and higher education. Our discussion started with a day in the life of a media strategist. Nick, thank you so much for sharing your time with the Association for Distance Education and Independent Learning today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored that you asked me.
You bet, you bet. So, Nick, what does a senior instructional media strategist do? What does your workday look like?
That's a great question. So, my workday can be, very different from day to day. In my role, I'm playing in a lot of different media disciplines: graphic design, motion design, videography, all sorts of different things. But I would say from a high level, um, each day, no matter what I'm doing, the core of it is working towards supporting course development. So, working hand in hand with instructional designers and subject matter experts to build engaging and effective media content for online degree programs.
Yeah, yeah. Which leads us wonderfully to the question I was going to ask. What makes a good example of instructional media?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways that one could answer this, and you might get different answers depending on who you ask. But I think that, no matter what, there's kind of some core things that I think make up a really good piece of instructional media content. And I think the first and foremost thing is it's got to be aligned with learning objectives. Over the course of one of the things I learned early on in my career in higher ed media development was, you can create something that looks really great, has all the bells and whistles, but if it doesn't have like a strong purpose or thought behind how it's actually going to serve students in the course, support their learning, then it's kind of a failed endeavor from the get-go. So that, to me, that's the first thing, is it's really got to be in support of learning objectives, support in the student experience. I think after that, other things that really are critical would be that engages learners. I know that's a term that gets thrown out a lot, the word engage, but I think just trying to draw interest, get them interested in the content, whether that's through uh, clean, dynamic design, colors, visuals, movement, something that's gonna to be engaging. And then I think another thing would be, can you bring in interactivity? Um, can you bring in, uh, you know, maybe it's not just getting them to click things, but maybe it's getting them to think about something. So trying to make that experience of digesting the content, moving that needle from passive to active as many different ways as you can. And then I think the final thing I'd say is, if you can tie it to real world applications, you know, um, I think, especially as somebody who's most of my experience has been working with adult learners. So any way you can tie it into um, a common experience or something that is relevant to how they may use the information. Um, I think that can be really powerful as well. So yeah, that'd be the last thing that I would say.
Yeah. You bring up such a fascinating point with that engagement and kind of interaction. Because on the one hand, like instructional media, generally speaking, it's this artifact that's created and then sent out to the students. Could you give like what are some examples that you've seen that really made you think like, yeah, this is what interaction with instructional media looks like?
Yeah, I would say one thing, a project that I've worked on in the past is, well, I'd say like anytime you can do like scenario-based media content, I think is really powerful.
Yeah.
So I've developed content before where you use a tool like Go React, where maybe students are presented with, a video, an animation, or something like that, and then they instantly have to respond to that. So I think that's a great example of like interactivity,
Yeah.
and also something that could help as much as you can replicate like a real world scenario. Um, so I think something like that was really great. There's again a lot of different types of scenario based learning,
Mhm.
but I think projects like that I've worked on before or seen, I've kind of said, "Oh yeah, that's going to be powerful," or we've gotten great feedback from the students on it.
Yeah, yeah. No, fascinating. So we've talked about the good of instructional media. What do you try to avoid with instructional media?
Yeah, so in a large part of my role is building the content, but
Yeah.
before that it's really deciding what content are we going to build, and usually that starts with there's we're working on a course, and there's some sort of problem we're trying to solve or something we're trying to address. Maybe that's like a learning gap, or there's a spot in the course where students are hitting a friction point, or we're trying to solve some sort of problem. Oftentimes I see myself in the business of problem solving, and media
Yeah.
is the instrument that I get to use to solve those problems. um, in those situations when I'm working with an instructional designer and a subject matter expert, and we're kind of contemplating, okay, well, how are we gonna address this problem, what are we going to create, I try to avoid being too prescriptive. And I think
Okay.
that can be a really easy pitfall to fall into, especially if you get into a situation where you have to do a lot of courses, a lot of media content. It
Hmm.
can be very easy to sort of fall into situation A arises, we give solution A.
Hmm.
And there is going to be some of that.
Hmm.
There's times where, hey, we've seen this situation before. Our tried and true solution to this is this.
Hmm.
But I also try to always be thinking creatively and think, how could we, is, stepping back, blank slate, we've been in this situation before, but is there something else we could do, something more unique, different? How could is there a different way? So I really try to be, um, uh, I try to unburden myself with what has use experience that I've had in the past, but not be too beholden to it when it comes to thinking about how are we going to do something in a course.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm reminded just with so many faculty support roles, we can get the question of like, what's the best way to do this? And I think of
Yeah.
my work as an instructional designer, like, so here's like 50 really good ways that we don't necessarily have a best, but we can talk through your course and what your goals are and who your
Yeah.
students are and align those ideas.
Yeah. And that is a lot of these questions oftentimes don't have an exact right
Yeah.
answer. Or I think sometimes it can be a thing to avoid would be thinking about tool rather than purpose first. Thinking
Yes.
about, sometimes I think there's a feeling of this is always going to be better than that, in terms of like, not to get too specific, but
No.
if you're
Yeah.
saying, oh, well, this should be a presentation, or this should be an infographic. And sometimes there are going to be scenarios where, yeah, one approach is definitely going to be better. But I always try to think about, it's not necessarily sometimes the modality and the approach, it is the execution of that, or
Yeah.
again, the thought behind why are we doing it, or how are we doing it. um, so I try to, again, avoid falling into its video presentation or talking head video or whatever. um, but then also, again, not get too caught up in one of those is better than the other. I've worked on I've worked on courses where we've done a video introduction,
Hmm.
and then I've worked on another course where we've done a written introduction. And I thought the written introduction was more engaging because again, it can come down to the, the core of the content, the execution.
Yeah. Yeah. No, which brings me very much, and we've kind of touched on this already, but we often think of instructional media as that video lecture. And I think especially during like the COVID shelter in place, I think for so many people that was
Mhm.
a path of least resistance. I'm used to lecturing. I have these tools
Yeah,
where we can have a video of me lecturing.
yeah,
And so that often
yes,
kind of turns into a default. But tell me a
yeah.
little bit more about what this
Which,
instructional media can look like. Tell me more
yeah,
about either these formats and how you might use them.
yeah. Well, first and foremost, I want to say, I do empathize with, many faculty are in the position of having to wear all of the hats when it comes to
Yeah.
building their online course.
Mhm.
So, a tool like PowerPoint and creating a video lecture, at the end of the day, you do need to give students content. You do need to get the course up and running. So I do empathize with faculty who are, oftentimes have to be their own media designer, tech support, instructional designer.
Yeah.
With that said, I think if you think about media in your daily life and all of the examples that you see of media,
Yeah.
there's a lot of different examples of media content. And so I think instructional media can be a lot of different things. If you think about just a video lecture, that could be in many different flavors. It could be slides with no narration. That's media content. It could be slides with audio narration, slide with video narration. And so I think some of the examples that I would point to that could be really good, especially I think ones that could be high, high ROI would be like an interview, like what we're doing here.
Yeah.
An interview is a great example of like instructional media content, bringing in an outside subject matter expert and interviewing them and tying to the lesson or module. That's something that I think can be very powerful that is very different than like typical video lecture. Um, I think another thing could be just like a video or screen recordings, software
Oh, yeah.
demonstrations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those can be really powerful demonstrations. Um, Even just infographics or interactive infographics with a tool like H5P.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that if you look around you in the world and see all the different types of media content, there's a lot of other things you can do. Even just an audio recording,
Yeah.
can be a really powerful tool.
In the next part of our conversation, we'll think through how much instructional media to include in a course.